This is the FM Gold channel of All India Radio. In the program Money Talk, we now bring you a dialogue on corporate social responsibility. The participants are Rohit Bansal, CEO, India Strategic Group, and Ashok Dasgupta, The Hindu.
9 areas have been identified under the draft CSR rules under which companies can claim credit to what they are supposed to do with 2% of their net profit. Eradicating extreme hunger and poverty. Second, promotion of education. 3, promoting gender equality and empowering women. 4, reducing child mortality and improving maternal health. 5, combating human immunodeficiency virus, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, malaria and other diseases. 6, ensuring environmental sustainability. 7, employment enhancing vocational skills. 8, social business projects. 9, contribution to Prime Minister's National Relief Fund or any other fund set up by central government or state governments for socio-economic development and relief for funds of welfare of scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, other backward castes, minorities and women, and any other areas which will be notified from time to time. Any CARPs, any problems over and above these 9 or 10 areas that you would like to suggest?
Well, I think it broadly covers all the social sector and socio-economic development programs that the government can think of. You see, you have just read out, it is gender equality, women empowerment, malaria, HIV/AIDS, and the entire gamut is the social sector activities. So that way it is pretty broad. But let me at the outset say that, CSR, corporate social responsibility per se, is not a new thing. I mean, if you look back, right from the colonial times, CSR activity has been there, maybe not in that particular name, but it was more as probably philanthropy or charity. All the big business houses like the Tatas, Birlas, Singhanias, they used to probably call it charity, charitable hospitals or certain schools. And mostly one particular group was, involved in building temples. And which is why you'll find that now in most cities in the country, you have one Birla Mandir. That was a part of what you now call a sort of CSR.
So a lot was happening when companies were coming forth and doing it voluntarily.
Exactly.
But then it was not mandatory, or at least it was not being nudged in a forceful and official manner.
The next phase was under Mahatma Gandhi's definition of CSR, a sort of trusteeship, which is why all these big houses, they set up trusts which were involved in similar activities and they widened their horizon. Currently, we are in a phase where, apart from public sector, which has been doing CSR activities right from the beginning, it was probably not known as CSR, but their day-to-day activity involved that. Let's take HEC Ranchi, for example. Now, they have their schools, they have a huge hospital. The poor people around do come to the hospital for treatment and they get free medicines. That is CSR. Any private sector company would have said that we are doing this. But public sector, the big ones, have been doing it for a long time. Then the private sector also got involved and they have been sort of advertising in a sense also when they pick up, let's say, a village and make that a role model village. All these things they have been doing. Now what has happened is, under the new companies bill that is being drafted, CSR activity, the government is trying to make it a statutory, legal, compulsory thing that companies have to take up, and under which they have put all these social sector programs. Now, the basic provision is almost about 800 to 1,000 companies would immediately come into the net, because the clauses that they have is that if your net worth is some 500 crore or so, if your revenue annual is about 1,000 crore or so, if that is what you do annually, then 2% of your net profit you'll have to bring in as corporate social responsibility. You'll have to fund the projects that you take up. And that 2% has to be an average of the preceding 3 years. Now, everything is fine, but I think this preceding 3 years complicates matters a bit, which I think corporates and analysts do not seem to be very happy about.
Well, you can't satisfy everybody at all times, but for sure the heart is in the right place. It is not merely a voluntary process, which used to be the case, as you brought out in the early years of last century and thereafter. In fact, why go to last century? One can go deeper and see there have been the temples in India have been built around the state giving in certain shares, and much contribution came from the Nagar Seths and the relevant corporate entities in those times. But here it is being made harder for you to escape. It is also not merely left to the public sector to take up these jobs. I mean, the critics of the public sector would say that they pay far more than 2% anyway. So some of them may be actually happy that this is being brought down in a word. But the critical question is that does it actually increase an entire opportunity of rent seeking by the income tax department or any agency which will be asked from time to time to see what constitutes corporate social responsibility, what is the accounting standard that has been adopted, and therefore the lacuna therein?
Well, that one will have to see. The simple thing is that these are now draft rules. I think by October 8th, various stakeholders, companies will have to get back to the government, and depending on what changes they want and how much is done, it will become a law. One thing is for certain, that all companies who fall under this mandatory provision of spending 2% of their net profit will have to set up separate departments.
If they don't have them already.
If they don't have. I think, except for a few, most of them, they may be having perhaps a CSR officer, nothing beyond that. But now, if 2% of your net profit is to be spent, they need a separate department because all the counting, etc., whatever their spending is annually, will come under audit. Second thing is that the projects that they take up should be very close to what the company is generally engaged in, because then it makes matters much simpler. Let's say, some of the foundations or such departments that are already working, there's a Piramal Foundation. Now, they are working into healthcare as such. Then you have this Asimji Premji Foundation, Wipros, that is again into healthcare education. Bill Melinda Gates Foundation, they're also into, these sort of activities. The best thing I think the corporates would do is take up these projects as a sort of pilot projects, and then you see the huge expending that the government center has these various social sector programs. If these are found to be good role models, then the government could follow it up and follow up these programs. If it could be tied up in this sort of a way, then the program will actually be a success. Take it up as a pilot project in certain villages or certain districts. See how they are performing. There should be regular auditing and retrospective sort of looking back on how it has functioned, which can then be taken up by the government. I think that would be the best thing to do.
Well, I'm not sure if they need to set up a full department. They certainly mandatorily under the draft rules do have to set up a CSR committee. Correct. Which shall prepare a monitoring mechanism. And thereafter, those companies which are not interested, frankly, to set up a whole bureaucracy from within and be creative in their accounting and show 20 heads under the same department as CSR. They can also outsource for the purpose of listeners who are interested in projects other than run by bureaucracies from within.
One thing is, Rohit, certain, that they'll have to perhaps take the help or involve NGOs who are already working in this sector, sanitation, education, maternity, welfare, all these sorts of, there are lots of NGOs, very serious NGOs that are working on it. In fact, some of the foundations that are already engaged in these activities have already tied up with various NGOs, and they're doing very well. Now, it all depends how sincere most of these, because now it is mandatory. It is by law. Companies, the ones that are sincere, will definitely go ahead for the betterment of society at large, the country at large. But there could be certain companies who, as you had earlier indicated, would sow sums going into CSR activities, but actually not spending it. This is where a sort of audit has to come in, and I don't know whether that will come under the lens of the company auditor or the CSR committee or outside agency.
What is also interesting is that these projects can be taken up across India, don't necessarily have to be from within the company, and like you said, can be taken up by civil society groups outside. But there is no talk yet of, in the draft rules, of projects outside of India. As India has an outreach and a responsibility to its neighborhood and as a stabilizing and important global power, it may be worthwhile for decision makers to think of why, if Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that you're talking about, not incorporated in India, can do work here, why wouldn't Indian civil society groups take this particular thing forward, corpuses and trust forward, and work in Africa, work in the neighborhood, and carry the Indian flag?
Rohit, I think that will definitely in later. You know, the simple fact is, the names that you mentioned, I mean the names that I also mentioned, all this foundation, it is not the company's wealth that has been brought into CSR activities. It is their personal wealth. Nilekani, for example, sold the personal shares and has put that into. Similar thing is with
Sudha Murthy also.
Sudha Murthy, Asinji Premji, Bill and Melinda Gates. It is not Microsoft. It is the Gates Foundation which is doing it, their personal wealth. Now, to achieve or to get to that state, I don't know how many companies would finally serve the needs of the country in the social sector programs and then outreach to the neighboring countries. It should definitely be on the canvas, but I think that will kick in at a later stage.
However, as Indian companies globalize, and Indian companies are, after all, in Tata Group, for example, are very significant, almost 45% of their turnover is outside of India, and they acquire more, this will only increase. For them to have an international focus in their extant CSR activities and the future ones, this would certainly help rather than create an artificial boundary around the landmass of India.
Absolutely right. But now that it is draft rules and comments and suggestions are invited by October 8th, we'll have to see what changes, fine-tuning takes place for this particular thing to move forward.
So all in all, as we wind down, an extremely forward-looking initiative by the government, by the rule makers, so to speak, and to involve corporate India into the rebuilding of society other than merely building their own companies, and for sure enhancing the concept of shareholder interest and shareholder role to having an overall societal role. And as in the words of Michael Porter at Harvard, this is truly shared value, and India certainly holds the beacon light here. Thank you, Ashok Das Gupta.
You were listening to a dialogue on corporate social responsibility. The participants were Rohit Bansal, CEO, India Strategic Group, and Ashok Das Gupta, The Hindu. It came to you in the program Money Talk, produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. This program is also available on our website, newsonair.nic.in. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.